The first time I caught Mirabelle trying to reset my bank password, I didn't scream. I sat down and waited. The government doesn't just deposit $450,000 for fun. It pays me for jumping into burning forests. Mirabelle didn't know about the trust fund I built for my deaf niece. Victoria, I am Megan, a smokejumper captain. If you've ever had family view you as an ATM, tell me where you're watching from. Let's get into this. The smoke was completely toxic. I pulled into the driveway of the Denver house just as the sun was dipping below the mountains. The exterior paint was peeling near the gutters, a detail I noticed because my job trains me to look for structural weaknesses. For 3 weeks, I had been breathing in ash, sleeping on dirt, and calculating wind trajectories to keep my crew alive. Coming back to civilization should have felt like a relief. Instead, standing on that porch, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. When I opened the front door, the house smelled of roasted garlic and expensive room spray. Mirabelle was standing in the kitchen, pouring a glass of white wine. She didn't rush over to hug me. She didn't ask if I was exhausted or if everyone on my crew had made it back safely. She simply leaned against the marble counter, took a slow sip of her wine, and smiled. It was the kind of smile you give a contractor who just finished a job. "Megan," Mirabelle said, her voice perfectly modulated. "You're back early. I hope that means the hazard pay is clearing this week." I stopped in the hallway, my heavy canvas duffel bag still gripping my shoulder. I didn't react. 12 years of facing walls of flame teaches you that oxygen feeds the fire. If you give them a reaction, you give them fuel. I simply nodded, slipped off my boots, and walked into the dining room. Douglas was already seated at the table. He was cutting a piece of chicken with intense concentration, acting as if the exact angle of his knife was the most important thing in the world. He didn't look up when I walked in. He hasn't really looked at me in years. "Dinner is ready," Douglas murmured, his eyes fixed firmly on his plate. I sat down. Over the next 45 minutes, Mirabelle guided the conversation with surgical precision. She didn't ask about the fires. She asked about my base salary adjustments. She casually brought up the cost of living increases and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, a new investment portfolio she was looking into. Every question was a probe, a quiet attempt to map out the borders of my financial landscape. I chewed my food slowly. I gave her vague, polite answers. I watched the way her eyes tracked my movements, filing away every syllable I spoke. Douglas kept eating in silence, the scrape of his fork against the porcelain echoing in the quiet room. He was a man pretending not to notice that his wife was pricing out his daughter's life. At 7:15 that evening, the interrogation finally paused. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, loaded silence of a predator waiting for the right moment. I wiped my mouth with a napkin, thanked Mirabelle for the meal, and stood up. I didn't feel anger yet. I felt something much colder. The game had officially started. The wooden stairs groaned slightly under my weight as I made my way to the second floor. The air up here was different, untouched by the heavy scent of Mirabelle's wine or the suffocating silence of Douglas's guilt. I walked to the last door on the left and pushed it open gently. Victoria was sitting on the rug, her small hands busy sorting a collection of colored wooden blocks. She was 7 years old, with eyes the exact shade of hazel as my late sister's. When the door moved, the shift in the air caught her attention. She turned, and her face lit up with a brilliance that instantly washed away the grime and exhaustion of the past 3 weeks. I dropped to my knees, and she ran into my arms. I held her tightly, burying my face in her hair, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo. When I pulled back, I raised my hands. "I missed you so much," I signed, keeping my movements deliberate and clear. "You smell like campfires," Victoria signed back, her small fingers moving with practiced grace. She reached up and tapped the pale pink hearing aid tucked behind her right ear. "It's quiet today." I smiled and kissed her forehead. Victoria was born with profound hearing loss. When my sister passed away, Victoria's world shattered. Mirabelle and Douglas offered a roof, but they never offered a home. To Mirabelle, Victoria was a convenient prop for social media, a way to project the image of a selfless, loving grandmother. Off camera, Victoria was treated like an inconvenience, a silent ghost meant to stay out of the way. That was the real reason I jumped out of airplanes into raging infernos. People look at my uniform and think I do it for the adrenaline or the glory. They are wrong. I do it for the hazard pay. I do it for the overtime. I do it because every hour I spend choking on smoke translates directly into dollars. And those dollars translate into the best speech therapy, top-tier audiologists, and a future where Victoria will never have to depend on the charity of people who view her as a burden. I sat with her for an hour, helping her build a tall, unbalanced tower out of her blocks. I watched her laugh when it toppled over. She didn't make a sound, but her joy was the loudest thing in the room. She was my anchor. Every time the heat of a wildfire threatened to break my resolve, I pictured her face. I tucked her into bed shortly after 8 o'clock. I smoothed the blanket over her shoulders, turned on the small nightlight shaped like a star, and stood in the doorway watching her breathe. The peace in this room was sacred. It was the only thing in the world I cared about protecting. I quietly closed the bedroom door behind me, but as I stood in the dark hallway, I knew the truth. Someone was cutting the rope. Sleep rarely comes easily after a deployment. Your body forgets how to rest on a soft mattress when it has grown accustomed to the hard, unpredictable earth. At midnight, I was still awake, staring at the shadows shifting across the ceiling of my childhood bedroom. Out of sheer habit, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. I opened my banking application, a routine check to ensure my latest hazard pay deposit had cleared. The screen loaded, but instead of my balance, a security notification flashed in stark red letters across the glass. 3 failed login attempts, all registered within the last 48 hours. I didn't sit up. My pulse didn't race. When you spend your life reading the behavior of fires, you learn not to panic at the first sign of smoke. You analyze it. The attempts were made from an unrecognized device, localized to the Denver area. They had tried using my mother's maiden name and the street I grew up on. It was a clumsy, amateur effort, but it wasn't a mistake. It was a targeted breach. I locked my phone and slid out of bed. The floorboards were cold against my bare feet. I needed a glass of water, or maybe I just needed to move. I walked softly down the stairs, the house completely silent around me. On my way to the kitchen, I passed Douglas's home office. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of moonlight spilling across the carpet. I stopped. Something compelled me to push the door open just a fraction more. The room was perfectly organized, exactly the way Mirabelle demanded it to be. But sitting on the edge of the printer tray, illuminated by the pale light from the window, was a small, square yellow sticky note. I stepped inside. I picked up the paper. Written in Mirabelle's looping, elegant handwriting was a 9-digit number. I recognized it instantly. It was Victoria's Social Security number. Directly beneath it, underlined twice, were 2 words, asset evaluation. I stood in the center of my father's office, the yellow paper feeling heavy in my hand. The coldness that had settled in my chest during dinner now spread to my veins. This wasn't just about my hazard pay anymore. Mirabelle wasn't just poking around the edges of my checking account. She was looking at Victoria. She was trying to put a price tag on the little girl sleeping upstairs. In the forest, when a fire jumps the containment line, you have a fraction of a second to decide your next move. You don't scream for help. You don't curse the wind. You pivot, you grab your tools, and you dig a new line. You dig until your hands bleed, because if you don't, everything burns. I placed the sticky note exactly where I found it. I walked back upstairs, returned to my room, and opened my laptop. I changed every password, enabled dual-factor authentication on every account, and locked my credit file. My line would be impenetrable. The next morning, I sat on the back porch with a mug of black coffee, watching the early sunlight hit the pine trees lining the fence. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. It was peaceful, but my mind was miles away, pulled back to a Tuesday afternoon 5 years ago. That was the day the phone rang while I was at the firehouse. My sister's car had lost traction on a slick mountain road. Just like that, the brightest light in my life was extinguished, leaving behind a terrified 2-year-old girl who couldn't hear the sirens. Douglas had completely collapsed. The grief hollowed him out, leaving nothing but a shell of the man who had raised us. Within 6 months, Mirabelle arrived. She didn't come to heal the family, she came to occupy it. She slowly replaced the curtains, repainted the walls in sterile grays, and pushed the framed photographs of my sister deep into the bottom drawer of the hallway cabinet. I let her do it. That was the hardest truth I had to swallow as I stared at my coffee. I let her take over. When you survive a tragedy that claims someone you love, a strange kind of guilt settles into your bones. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. I felt deeply responsible for Victoria, but my job required me to be gone for weeks at a time, sleeping in tents in the wilderness. I convinced myself that Victoria needed a stable home, a grandfather, and a maternal figure, even if that figure was cold and calculating. I traded my boundaries for the illusion of peace. Every time Mirabelle made a passive-aggressive comment about my career, I stayed silent. Every time she posted perfectly staged photos of Victoria on social media, with captions about the blessings of being a grandmother, while ignoring the child for the rest of the day, I bit my tongue. I told myself it was a small price to pay to ensure Victoria had a warm bed and a structured routine while I was away fighting fires. But looking at the digital alerts on my phone and remembering the yellow sticky note in the office, the illusion finally shattered. Mirabelle wasn't providing a home. She was managing an investment. She looked at the money I sent back, the checks I wrote for Victoria's specialized schooling, and saw a resource she wasn't controlling. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The bitter taste grounded me. I had spent 5 years convincing myself that keeping the peace was an act of love. I had been wrong. Real protection isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about standing firmly at the gate and refusing to let the wolves inside, no matter how nicely they knock. Douglas walked onto the porch, holding his own mug. He looked at me, gave a weak, non-committal smile, and looked away towards the trees. He didn't ask how I slept. The picture faced the wall. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the wooden planks of the porch, but the chill inside me remained untouched. People often ask how someone whose profession involves parachuting into raging infernos could allow themselves to be manipulated at home. It is a fair question. The truth is wrapped in a psychological phenomenon that trauma counselors call learned helplessness, though I always just called it surviving. When my sister died 5 years ago, my world did not just break, it completely dissolved. I was 30 years old, navigating the rigorous ranks of the smokejumper program, spending weeks at a time sleeping on the hard earth, entirely consumed by the physical demands of fire containment. When the funeral was over, Douglas was a hollowed-out ghost of a man. Victoria was a confused, grieving 2-year-old child who could not hear the words meant to comfort her. Then Mirabelle arrived. She moved into the house with the efficiency of an estate liquidator. She packed away my sister's photographs, changed the drapes, and established a rigid daily routine. I watched it happen, and I did nothing. I let her take over the space because I felt an overwhelming, crushing guilt. I was the one who survived, but I was also the one who was never there. My career demanded my absence, leaving Victoria in need of a stable, consistent presence. I convinced myself that Mirabelle's passive-aggressive comments about my career were just a rough exterior. I told myself that her obsession with my hazard pay was merely practical financial concern for the household. For exactly 4 years and 2 months, I traded my boundaries for the illusion of family peace. every time she treated Victoria like a prop for a quick photograph. I bit my tongue and wrote another check for the speech therapist. I accepted the disrespect because I believed it was the toll I had to pay to ensure my niece had a functioning roof over her head while I was out saving forests. But looking at the digital alerts on my phone, the chain finally snapped. I realized that keeping the peace was not an act of love. It was an act of surrender. Mirabelle was not providing a sanctuary for a deaf child. She was cultivating a financial asset, and she was doing it right under my nose. I had spent years treating the symptoms of our broken family, completely ignoring the disease. I finished my coffee. The bitter liquid felt like a necessary shock to my system. I stood up, rinsed the mug in the kitchen sink, and wiped the counter until it was spotless. The time for making excuses for the people living in this house had expired. If Mirabelle wanted to treat my life like a ledger, I was going to show her exactly how an auditor operates. The illusion was completely shattered. The next day began with a quiet, deliberate shift in my routine. Usually, I spent my mornings on leave, avoiding the main living areas, letting Mirabelle dominate the kitchen while I read in my room. Today, I was downstairs before 8 o'clock, dressed and waiting. When the mail truck pulled up to the curb at 10:15, I was already walking out the front door before the carrier could even unlatch the mailbox. I greeted him, took the stack of envelopes, and walked back inside, leaning against the heavy oak door. I sifted through the glossy catalogs, the utility bills, and the credit card offers addressed to Douglas. Then, nestled near the bottom, I found it. It was a crisp, white envelope bearing the logo of my primary banking institution. It was addressed directly to me. I carried the stack into the kitchen and set the bills on the counter. I held my envelope up to the light spilling through the window. The flap was sealed, but not seamlessly. The paper along the edge was slightly warped, carrying the faint, unmistakable ripple that occurs when adhesive has been exposed to steam, opened, and clumsily pressed back together. The glue was still the slightest bit tacky to the touch. I slid a butter knife under the flap and opened it. Inside was a formal security notification. It was a standardized letter informing me that a recent request to change the primary recovery email address on my account had been denied due to a failed security question protocol. The email address they had attempted to substitute was a generic, newly created account, but it incorporated the year Mirabelle was born. She was not just guessing my passwords in the middle of the night. She was taking methodical, calculated steps to intercept my financial correspondence. She wanted to route my banking alerts to an inbox she controlled, effectively blinding me to any future transactions she planned to execute. It was a brazen, remarkably arrogant move for someone living under the same roof. I folded the letter exactly along its original creases and slid it back into the warped envelope. I felt a profound sense of clarity. In my line of work, the most dangerous fires are not the ones raging in the canopy above. They are the root fires, burning silently underground, consuming the foundation until the trees simply collapse without warning. Mirabelle was a root fire. I placed the envelope securely into the deep pocket of my cargo pants. I did not confront her when she walked into the kitchen 10 minutes later to pour her morning tea. I smiled, offered a polite remark about the weather, and watched her sip her drink with the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she held all the cards. She was rerouting my life. I told Mirabelle and Douglas I was going for a long run to clear my head. It was a plausible excuse. Smoke jumpers require elite cardiovascular endurance, and maintaining my physical conditioning was a non-negotiable part of my daily life. I laced up my running shoes, stretched on the front porch, and set off down the suburban street at a steady, rhythmic pace. The crisp Colorado air filled my lungs, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside that house. I ran past neatly manicured lawns and identical driveways, my heart rate climbing to a steady, controlled beat. Exactly 2 miles from the house, the neighborhood gave way to a sprawling public park. I slowed my pace, jogging over the damp grass until I reached the base of a massive, ancient oak tree sitting far away from the walking paths. I sat down on the exposed roots, pulling my phone from my armband. I did not call the standard customer service line. I dialed the direct number for my bank's elite fraud prevention unit, a contact I had saved years ago when I first started accumulating significant hazard pay. A representative named Elmer answered. His voice was professional, sharp, and attentive. I verified my identity using my newly established biometric passcodes and a verbal PIN I had memorized a decade ago. Then, I requested a comprehensive, verbal readout of every login attempt, failed verification, and customer service inquiry attached to my profile over the past 6 months. I sat under the oak tree, watching a flock of birds circle overhead, while Elmer read the data. There had been 11 separate attempts. The caller had tried to verify my identity using my mother's maiden name, the street address of my childhood home, and the make of my first car. They had even attempted to authorize a wire transfer of $40,000, falsely claiming I was deployed overseas without internet access and needed emergency funds routed to a family member. The voice on the recorded calls, Elmer noted, pausing slightly, was a female claiming to be your designated financial proxy. "I have no proxy, Elmer," I replied, my voice as steady as the trunk I leaned against. "And I never will." I asked him to flag the account for maximum security, requiring in-person verification with military identification for any future changes. I thanked him and ended the call. The silence of the park rushed back in. I stood up and began the 2-mile run back to the house. I did not need any more guesses. The digital footprints were stamped deep into the system, undeniable and permanent. Paper simply never lies. The perfect opportunity arrived the following afternoon. Mirabelle had an engagement with her local book club, a gathering, where I suspected more wine was consumed than actual literature discussed. She spent an hour applying her makeup before driving off in her pristine sedan. Douglas, predictable as a clock, retreated to the living room armchair for his afternoon nap, the television murmuring softly in the background. The house was completely still. I walked quietly down the hallway, the hardwood floors cold against my socks, and stepped into Douglas's home office. I closed the door behind me until the latch clicked shut with a barely audible sound. The room smelled of old paper and the specific, musky cologne my father had worn since the 1990s. I bypassed the desk and went straight to the heavy metal filing cabinet tucked in the corner. The top 2 drawers were unlocked, filled with mundane tax returns and utility receipts. The bottom drawer, however, stuck slightly. I applied firm, even pressure, wiggling the handle until the metal tracks yielded and the drawer slid open. Inside, buried beneath a stack of expired warranties, was a thick, unmarked manila folder. I pulled it out and set it on the desk. The first few pages were seemingly innocent, a certified copy of my birth certificate, my old high school diploma, and a voided passport from my early 20s. But as I peeled back the layers, the true architecture of Mirabelle's greed revealed itself. I found a printed bank statement from a checking account I had closed 3 years ago. I found a photocopy of my military identification card. Then, I found the life insurance policy. It was a comprehensive policy I had taken out at 25, designed solely to provide for Victoria in the event a wildfire claimed my life. I stared at the crisp white paper. On the page detailing the beneficiary designations, there were aggressive, black ink marks. Someone had literally tried to cross out Victoria's legal guardian trust details and had written Mirabelle's full legal name into the secondary beneficiary slot. The amendment had been stamped, rejected, unauthorized signature by the insurance provider. I traced the rejected stamp with my index finger. Mirabelle had actually attempted to position herself to profit from my death. She was banking on a wind shift, a failed parachute, or a sudden wall of flame to cash in on my life. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was exactly 2:14 in the afternoon. That was the exact minute I stopped seeing the man sleeping in the living room as my father. He had let this woman turn my existence into a speculative asset. I pulled out my phone and meticulously photographed every single document in the folder. He was just a stranger. I was about to close the folder when a heavy piece of cardstock near the very back caught my eye. It was folded neatly in half, distinct from the standard printer paper surrounding it. I pulled it free and smoothed it flat against the mahogany surface of the desk. It was a legal document, a standardized, pre-drafted template for a durable power of attorney. I read the text, my eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs with clinical precision. The document was designed to grant Mirabelle total, unmitigated control over my financial assets, my real estate holdings, and my medical directives. In the section demanding a justification for the transfer of power, someone had typed, "Principal is engaged in high-risk, hazardous employment, smokejumper/wildland firefighter, and is frequently out of communication, requiring local management of domestic and financial affairs." They were weaponizing my dedication to my career. They were using the very job that paid for Victoria's medical care as the excuse to strip me of my autonomy. The document was not notarized. It was an incomplete draft, a tool waiting for the right moment of crisis to be deployed. But it was the bottom of the page that caused the temperature in the room to plummet. There were 3 signature lines. One for the principal, which remained blank, waiting for my forged or coerced consent. One for the designated agent, where Mirabelle had already signed her name in bold, sweeping blue ink. And then there was the line for the witness. Resting proudly on that line was the unmistakable, jagged signature of Douglas, my own father. I stood perfectly still, the silence of the office pressing heavily against my eardrums. For days, I had operated under the assumption that Douglas was merely a coward. I thought he was a broken man who looked the other way because confronting his wife was too exhausting. But the blue ink on this cardstock told a completely different story. He was not a passive bystander. He was a co-conspirator. He had willingly sat at this desk, picked up a pen, and signed his name to a document designed to legally erase my independence and steal the funds meant for his deaf granddaughter. The betrayal did not burn. It froze. It crystallized every lingering doubt, every shred of familial obligation I had carried since my sister's funeral, turning it into cold, hard ice. I photographed the document, ensuring his signature was in perfect focus, and uploaded the file directly to my secure cloud server. I slipped the cardstock back into the folder, placed the folder exactly where I found it in the bottom drawer, and pushed the metal cabinet shut. He chose her greed over my life. Now, I would choose myself. When you discover a breach in your perimeter, noise is your greatest enemy. Confrontation without absolute evidence only gives the other side time to clean up their tracks. Burn the documents and play the victim. I did not storm downstairs. I did not scream at Douglas for his cowardly signature. I walked back to my bedroom, locked the door, and opened my laptop. For the next 3 hours, I worked with the cold, methodical precision of a smoke jumper cutting a fire line. I logged into my primary financial institution and completely dismantled my existing profile. I changed my login credentials, bypassing standard security questions in favor of a complex, biometric-gated authorization protocol. I transferred the entirety of my $450,000 savings into a new, heavily encrypted vault account. I did not stop at the bank. I called my cell phone provider and placed a hard lock on my SIM card, ensuring no one could impersonate me to intercept my authentication texts. I reviewed my credit file and placed a permanent freeze with all 3 major bureaus. Every digital avenue Mirabelle could potentially use to siphon my assets was permanently sealed with concrete. I uploaded the photographs I had taken of the forged power of attorney, complete with Douglas's signature, to 3 separate, secure cloud servers. I organized them into a digital dossier, cross-referenced with the timestamps of the failed bank logins provided by Elmer. I sat back in my chair and looked at the glowing screen. The adrenaline that had spiked in the office was gone, replaced by a profound, hollow calm. I had spent 12 years building an independent life, risking my physical safety to ensure Victoria would never have to beg for anything. Mirabelle thought she could quietly drill a hole in the bottom of our boat while I was away. She severely underestimated how well I understood the mechanics of survival. I dug a trench around my finances so wide and so deep that Mirabelle's greed would starve long before it ever reached my perimeter. The fire would burn out. Sunday evening dinner felt like stepping into an alternate reality. The dining room smelled of roasted pork, fresh rosemary, and absolute delusion. I sat at my usual spot, my posture relaxed, my expression perfectly neutral. Across the table, Mirabelle was pouring a heavy glass of red wine, her eyes sparkling with the manic energy of someone who believes they are on the verge of a major victory. She dominated the conversation, steering it toward real estate. She spoke animatedly about a sprawling, multi-level vacation property she had recently toured in Aspen. She described the vaulted ceilings, the wraparound deck overlooking the slopes, and the expansive guest rooms. It was a property that cost well over $1 million, a figure entirely out of reach for a retired mid-level manager like Douglas, and a woman who had never held a steady job. "The market is just perfect right now," Mirabelle noted, taking a delicate bite of her meal. "We are expecting a rather significant investment payout to clear very soon. It's the perfect time to upgrade our lifestyle, don't you think, Douglas?" Douglas nodded slowly, avoiding my gaze entirely. He looked older than he had just a few days ago, his shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of the secret he thought he was keeping. He mumbled something about the altitude and Aspen being good for the joints, a pathetic attempt to validate her fantasy. I chewed my food slowly, studying the two of them. It was a fascinating psychological study in entitlement. Mirabelle had already spent my money in her mind. She had already decorated the Aspen house with the hazard pay I earned by breathing in toxic smoke. She looked at me, not as a stepdaughter, but as a walking, breathing funding source. And Douglas sat right beside her, acting as the silent enabler, trading his dignity for a quiet evening. I did not challenge them. I did not ask where this sudden windfall was coming from. I smiled politely, offered a non-committal hum of agreement, and took a sip of my water. I watched them the way a scientist watches a chemical reaction inside a contained glass box. They had exactly 72 hours left in their comfortable little illusion before the glass shattered completely. I let them keep dreaming. The dessert plates had just been cleared when Mirabelle decided to push her luck. The wine had loosened her tongue, stripping away the thin veneer of subtlety she usually employed. She folded her linen napkin, placed it on the table, and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished wood. "You know, Megan," Mirabelle said, her voice dropping into a tone of manufactured maternal concern. "We were thinking about Victoria. That poor girl needs fresh air. The city pollution is terrible for her development." I stopped wiping the condensation from my water glass. I looked directly into her eyes, my face an unreadable mask. "Victoria is doing wonderfully with her specialists here in Denver. Mirabelle?" "Yes, but think of the mountains," Mirabelle countered smoothly, waving her hand as if painting a picture. "The Aspen house would be perfect for her. We were actually discussing the trust fund you set up. Since the house would benefit her health, it only makes sense to pool those resources. It's an investment in her future, really." The room went dead silent. Douglas suddenly found his empty plate incredibly fascinating. He swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. The audacity was almost breathtaking. Mirabelle was not just hinting at my savings anymore. She was openly attempting to justify raiding a medical trust fund designed to protect a deaf, orphaned child, all to finance a luxury ski chalet for herself. She framed the theft as a charitable act. It was a masterclass in manipulation, delivered with a warm, caring smile. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I leaned forward, mirroring her posture, and lowered my voice to a whisper that carried the weight of a falling anvil. "Victoria's money does not buy vacations." "Mirabelle," I said, articulating every single syllable with absolute, terrifying clarity. "Her trust is a fortress, and nobody in this room has the keys." Mirabelle's smile faltered, the corners of her mouth twitching as the mask slipped for a fraction of a second. She opened her mouth to argue, to play the victim, to accuse me of being ungrateful. But the look in my eyes stopped her cold. She leaned back, her face flushing a deep, angry red. Douglas remained entirely mute, paralyzed by the tension radiating across the table. The silence was absolutely deafening. Monday morning brought the final piece of the puzzle. I was standing in the kitchen, watching through the window as Victoria played in the backyard, drawing crooked chalk flowers on the concrete patio. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a secure email notification from Elmer at the bank's fraud department. Attached was an encrypted audio file. I put in my wireless earbuds, turned my back to the kitchen entrance, and pressed play. The recording began with the standard automated greeting, followed by the crisp voice of a bank representative asking for the account holder's name. Then, a voice answered. It was Mirabelle. She was adopting a lower, softer register, mimicking the cadence she thought I used when speaking to professionals. "This is Megan Hayes," Mirabelle's recorded voice claimed, oozing with false confidence. "I'm currently deployed and having terrible connectivity issues. I need to bypass my two-factor authentication and add a secondary user to my primary accounts immediately." I listened as the representative asked the security questions. Mirabelle rattled off my mother's maiden name and my childhood street with practiced ease. But then, the representative triggered the fail-safe Elmer and I had established years ago. They asked for the military identification verification code, a specific alphanumeric sequence known only to me and my commanding officer. There was a long, awkward pause on the tape. Mirabelle stuttered. She tried to laugh it off, claiming she had left her ID in her barracks. The representative politely informed her that the request was denied and the account would remain locked. The call abruptly disconnected. I pulled the earbuds out. The contrast was jarring, the sweet, innocent sight of my niece drawing flowers in the sun, juxtaposed against the vile, calculated theft echoing in my ears. Mirabelle had not just snooped, she had committed felony wire fraud. She had impersonated a military officer in an attempt to hijack hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you've ever found undeniable, concrete proof of someone's lies and felt that cold rush of vindication, hit the like button. Because Mirabelle had just handed me the weapon to destroy her. I forwarded the audio file to my secure server, backing it up alongside the forged power of attorney. The intelligence gathering phase of my operation was officially complete. I had the motives, I had the documents, and now I had the confession. It was time to strike. I left the house before noon, telling Douglas I had some military administrative paperwork to sort out downtown. It wasn't entirely a lie. I drove straight into the heart of the business district, parking beneath a sleek, glass-fronted building. I took the elevator to the 14th floor and walked into a law office that smelled of expensive leather and polished cedar. Clara was waiting for me. She was a senior partner specializing in estate law and fiduciary trusts. She had worked with my mother decades ago, and she was the architect who helped me build Victoria's trust fund after my sister passed. Clara was a woman carved from granite sharp, unsentimental, and ruthlessly efficient. She wore tortoiseshell glasses and a tailored gray suit that commanded immediate respect. I sat down in the heavy leather chair opposite her massive desk. I didn't waste time with small talk. I pulled a secure tablet from my bag, unlocked it, and handed it across the desk. I played the audio recording of Mirabelle. Then, I swiped to the high-resolution photograph of the forged power of attorney bearing my father's signature. Clara listened to the tape without changing her expression. She reviewed the photograph, zooming in on Douglas's handwriting. When she finally set the tablet down, she took off her glasses and let out a slow, measured breath. "I have seen family members do despicable things for money. Megan," Clara said, her voice dry and authoritative. "But attempting to leverage a smokejumper's hazardous duty to seize a disabled child's medical fund is a special kind of vile." She stood up, walked over to a heavy filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick folder bearing a red embossed seal. It was the master file for Victoria's irrevocable trust. She placed it on the desk between us, her hand resting flat against the cover. "Mirabelle thinks she is playing a game of checkers," Clara said, a dangerous, razor-thin smile touching her lips. "She does not realize we built a system that plays chess. It is time to review the exact mechanisms of the traps we set 10 years ago. When she tries to break this door down, the house is going to collapse on top of her." I nodded, feeling the cold satisfaction settle deep into my bones. I was not alone in this fight. I had the law, I had the evidence, and I had the smartest person in the room sitting directly across from me. The fortress was fully armed. Clara sat back in her heavy leather chair, her hands steepled together over the master file of Victoria's trust. The office was incredibly quiet, insulated from the city noise below. This was the moment the balance of power permanently shifted, not through yelling or emotional outbursts, but through the cold, flawless architecture of the law. "An irrevocable trust," Clara began, her voice taking on the precise, authoritative cadence of a law professor, "is not a simple savings account. It is an entirely separate sovereign entity. Once the funds were placed inside 10 years ago, they ceased to belong to you, Megan. They belong exclusively to the trust, managed by a third-party fiduciary, which is me, for the sole and exclusive benefit of Victoria's medical and educational needs." I nodded slowly, letting her outline the absolute security of our perimeter. "Even you cannot pull funds from this account for a vacation property," Clara continued, a sharp glint in her eyes. "Therefore, Mirabelle's forged power of attorney is worse than useless. It holds absolutely no legal jurisdiction over a third-party trust. But it gets better." She opened the file and pointed to a specific clause highlighted in yellow. It was the mechanism my mother had insisted upon before she passed the ultimate failsafe. "The dead man's switch," Clara said. "If the financial institution detects any fraudulent breach utilizing forged documents, the account does not just temporarily lock. It triggers a permanent forensic audit. Every connected asset, including any joint accounts shared by the perpetrator, is immediately frozen, pending a federal investigation. Mirabelle's fake power of attorney is essentially a signed, documented confession of her intent to defraud a disabled minor. Mirabelle thought she had found a clever backdoor into my financial life. In reality, she was walking blindfolded straight into a legal landmine. She was relying on the assumption that family members forgive each other to keep the peace. She had no idea she was dealing with a system designed specifically to destroy predators. If you love seeing greedy people walk blindfolded into a legal trap they can't escape, hit that like button. Because Mirabelle was about to detonate her own life. Clara closed the folder and looked at me, sliding a single sheet of paper across the desk. It contained a newly generated, highly monitored routing number. It was the bait. "Let her try," Clara said quietly. The trap was completely set. Friday morning arrived with a clear, blue sky that completely belied the storm I was about to unleash inside the house. I walked downstairs at exactly 8:45, carrying my laptop and a freshly printed sheet of paper. Mirabelle was in the kitchen, carefully arranging her organic teas in a glass display box. She wore her usual expression of serene entitlement. I set my laptop on the kitchen island. Beside it, I casually placed the printed document. I made sure the bold header was perfectly visible asset summary, liquid transfers. Just beneath the title was the specific, heavily monitored routing number Clara had generated for me the day before. It looked incredibly official, incredibly lucrative, and entirely unprotected. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, keeping my movements slow and unhurried. Mirabelle's eyes immediately darted toward the paper. I could see the subtle shift in her posture, the predatory sharpening of her focus as she tried to read the numbers upside down. "I need to take a quick call upstairs," I said smoothly. leaving my phone on the counter right next to the document. "I'll be right back." I walked up the wooden stairs, my footsteps deliberately heavy so she could track my location. I went into my bedroom, quietly closed the door, and stood perfectly still. I did not make a phone call. I simply looked at my watch and counted the seconds. When you are waiting for a crown fire to hit a containment line, time seems to stretch into infinity. You have to trust the preparation. I waited exactly 14 minutes. Then, I walked back downstairs. Mirabelle was standing by the sink, aggressively scrubbing a perfectly clean coffee mug. My laptop remained exactly where I had left it, but the printed document had been shifted 1/4 of an inch to the left, and the edge was slightly bent. Mirabelle's smartphone was sitting on the counter, the camera lens still carrying a fresh, oily smudge from her thumb. She had taken the bait. She had photographed the routing number, believing she had just uncovered the golden key to Victoria's trust fund and her future ski chalet in Aspen. I picked up my laptop and the paper, offering her a brief, meaningless smile. "All done," I said casually. "Everything going well with your finances, dear?" Mirabelle asked, unable to keep the sickeningly sweet curiosity out of her voice. "Perfectly," I replied. I walked back upstairs, sat on the edge of my bed, and pulled out my secondary, encrypted mobile device. I opened a secure messaging application and sent a 2-word text directly to Clara's private number. "Trigger it." The steel jaws snapped shut. Saturday evening, 7:30. The dinner dishes had just been cleared away. Douglas was wiping his mouth with a napkin, preparing to offer his usual, muttered excuse before retreating to his armchair and the safety of the television. Mirabelle was reaching for the open bottle of wine to pour her second glass of the night. "Sit down," I said. My voice was not loud. It was not angry. It was the exact, measured tone I use on the radio when a wind shift threatens to trap my crew in a canyon. It was a voice that commanded absolute compliance. Douglas froze halfway out of his chair. He looked at me, confusion flickering across his aging face, and slowly lowered himself back down. Mirabelle's hand paused over the wine bottle. She narrowed her eyes, instantly sensing the atmospheric drop in the room, but she masked her apprehension with a patronizing sigh. "Megan, really, the dramatic tone isn't necessary," Mirabelle began. I completely ignored her. I unzipped the leather portfolio I had carried down with me and extracted 3 heavy manila folders. I placed them down on the polished glass surface of the dining table. The sound of the thick paper hitting the glass was sharp, like the clicking of a deadbolt. I opened the first folder and slid a printed spreadsheet toward Mirabelle. "This is a comprehensive login history from my bank's fraud department. It details 11 unauthorized attempts to access my accounts over the past 6 months, originating from this specific residential IP address." Douglas blinked, his gaze darting between the paper and my face. "Megan, what is this?" I opened the second folder and slid the high-resolution photograph toward him. It was the forged, durable power of attorney. "This is a fraudulent legal document designed to strip me of my financial autonomy," I said, my eyes locking directly onto his. "And right there, at the bottom, is your signature, acting as a willing witness to the theft of your own granddaughter's medical fund." The color drained from Douglas's face so fast he looked physically ill. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stared at his own signature as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the glass table. Have you ever had to confront your own parents with their lies and watch the color drain from their faces? Let me know in the comments if this resonates, because what happens next changed my family forever. I placed a small, silver USB drive in the center of the table. The trial had officially begun. The silence in the dining room was absolute. Douglas sat paralyzed, unable to tear his eyes away from the forged document. The undeniable proof of his cowardice stared right back at him. I did not yell. I needed him to face reality. I leaned forward and directed my attention to the man I used to call Dad. Do you know why the government pays me $450,000? Douglas, I asked, stripping away the title of Dad. He swallowed hard. Because you're an officer. It's a government contract. No, I replied coldly. They pay me to step out of helicopters into 1,000-degree environments. They pay me for the smoke inhalation taking years off my life, and for the letters I write to the parents of dead crewmates. Every single dollar is paid in blood and risk, I continued. I do it to ensure that Victoria will never have to worry about the cost of a specialist, a hearing aid, or a safe place to sleep. Douglas closed his eyes, a single tear escaping. And while I was jumping into fires to keep her safe, I said, you sat in your office and signed a document to help your wife steal her medical fund for a luxury ski house in Aspen. He looked at me, utterly broken. He had spent his life avoiding conflict, but now the ugly truth sat across the table, stripping away every excuse. He had absolutely nothing left. The silence broke with the scraping of a chair. Mirabelle pushed back from the table, flushed with indignant rage. The mask of the caring maternal figure dissolved, revealing the cornered predator underneath. You are being incredibly dramatic. Megan! Mirabelle snapped. I was trying to consolidate our assets. You are gone for months. Family shares its resources. I took care of this house when your father fell apart. She stood up, pointing a finger at me. You think you can just play the victim. I am your family. I didn't argue or defend my choices. Instead, I calmly picked up my smartphone, turned the volume to maximum, and pressed play. The audio file filled the dining room. This is Megan Hayes. I'm currently deployed. I need to bypass my two-factor authentication. Mirabelle's recorded voice echoed, reading off my mother's maiden name and childhood address. Mirabelle froze, her pointing finger slowly lowering. The angry flush vanished, replaced by a sickly white. She stared at the phone. This was not a family argument. It was an execution. I paused the recording. That is felony wire fraud and federal impersonation of a military officer, I stated flatly. By attempting to breach an irrevocable trust, you triggered the bank's dead man switch. They handed the entire file to federal investigators 48 hours ago. Mirabelle's knees buckled. She grabbed the table to steady herself, gasping. She looked at Douglas for support, but he was staring blindly at his empty plate. You aren't family, Mirabelle, I said, slipping the folders back into my portfolio. You are a toxic liability. Douglas finally found his voice, stripped of all paternal authority. Megan, please, he whispered, reaching across the table. Don't involve federal authorities. Mirabelle made a mistake, but we are your family. We share the same blood. I looked at his outstretched hand, but didn't reach back. The illusion I had maintained for 5 years was dead. Blood is a biological coincidence. Douglas, I said coldly. It doesn't grant you a free pass to orchestrate a theft against a disabled child. I stood up. Family isn't about DNA. Family stands between you and the fire. You didn't protect me or Victoria. You held the door open for the thief because it was easier than standing up to her. Douglas shrank into his chair. He had spent years assuming my loyalty to our bloodline would override my common sense, treating the title of father as a shield. He was fatally wrong. I am done, I said with finality. I am severing all ties with both of you. You will never go near Victoria again. I picked up my portfolio, turned my back, and walked to the stairs. I spent the next hour packing our bags. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a crime scene. Around 9 o'clock, I heard frantic footsteps from the master bedroom. I watched silently from the hall. Mirabelle was dragging a suitcase out of her closet, panicking. The reality of a federal investigation had pierced her arrogance. She threw clothes and jewelry into the bag, muttering about staying at a hotel. She grabbed her credit cards and dialed a concierge service. Yes, I need a suite for tonight, she said, her voice shaking. Put it on the platinum card ending in 42. What do you mean declined? She stared at the phone in disbelief, then quickly dialed her bank. I already knew what the recording said. The dead man's switch didn't just alert authorities. It mandated a comprehensive asset freeze. Every account connected to Mirabelle and Douglas was locked down. Mirabelle dropped the phone. She looked at the frozen plastic cards scattered on the bed. She had no access to a single dollar. She was trapped. I walked back into my room and shut the door. She had nothing left. Monday morning brought a desperate counterattack. I was loading the truck when Mirabelle arrived with a lawyer in tow. He handed me a stack of papers. Megan Hayes. I represent Mirabelle. We are filing for a medical conservatorship over Victoria. My client asserts your occupation has caused severe PTSD, making you unfit to care for a minor. Mirabelle stood behind him with a vindictive smile, trying to weaponize my job as proof of instability. I didn't panic. I just smiled, pulled a stamped manila envelope from my jacket, and handed it to the lawyer. "Open it," I said. He pulled out the document, a Class A federal psychological evaluation. It detailed my flawless cognitive function and psychological stability, which I had just passed to make captain. The lawyer scanned the federal signatures and turned to Mirabelle. "You told me she was having documented breakdowns," he hissed. "This is a federal clearance. You lied. I am not losing my license over your fraud." He shoved the papers into his briefcase and drove away. Mirabelle stood alone in the driveway, her last attempt at leverage obliterated. In the weeks that followed, the federal investigation rapidly dismantled Mirabelle's life. Clara monitored the fallout. Mirabelle was indicted for wire fraud and identity theft against a minor's protected trust. Facing undeniable evidence, she took a plea deal, 5 years of probation, and massive restitution fees that forced her into bankruptcy. Douglas didn't fare much better. Exposed as an accomplice, he filed for divorce to salvage his reputation, but the ensuing legal battle drained his remaining retirement savings. 2 months later, Clara sent me a photo of my childhood home. Planted firmly on the lawn was a signed foreclosure. Public auction. I felt no triumph, only the satisfaction of a completed equation. The fire they started had burned their own sanctuary to the ground. I deleted the photograph. My perimeter was secure, and the toxic elements were neutralized. We didn't stay in Colorado, having secured full custody of Victoria. I liquidated my assets and drove us to the Pacific Northwest. I bought a log cabin nestled deep in a valley of Douglas firs, far from the suffocating environment we had left behind. I transferred to an elite fire management team, coordinating containment from a central base. I was finally home every night. One morning, I stood on the porch and watched Victoria in the garden. She wore bright yellow boots, enthusiastically planting sunflower seeds. I caught her eye. Growing big, I signed. Victoria grinned. The biggest in the world. She signed back with unfiltered joy. The tension was gone. She was simply a child growing in a protected space. Her trust fund remained locked away, ensuring her future. The chain of survivor's guilt tying me to Denver was gone. For the first time since my sister passed, I was actually living. Wealth is a tool. In Mirabelle's hands, a weapon. In the right hands, a foundation. With Victoria's future secured, I had a significant surplus of hazard pay. I called Clara to draft new documents. I established a scholarship fund for the children of fallen wildland firefighters, named after my sister. Within a year, it paid tuition for 3 teenagers, using money earned from the fire to help others rise from the ashes. As for Douglas, Clara negotiated a rigid visitation agreement. He could see Victoria once a month for 2 hours via a supervised video call. The primary condition was his mandatory weekly therapy. He complied out of sheer desperation. During the calls, he looked older and remarkably small. I sat off camera to ensure Victoria was safe. It was a cold arrangement, but an impenetrable boundary. I sat on my porch, watching the sun dip behind the evergreens. Inside, I could hear the music Victoria was playing. I thought about the forged signatures, the fake calls, and the greedy attempts to consume what I had built. In the forest, we are trained to fear sudden wind shifts, but I had learned a harder lesson sometimes. The fire is already burning inside your own home, fueled by those who claim to love you. Protection isn't just fighting flames outside. It's refusing to let anyone burn down the house from within. I drew my line in the dirt and held it. The fire was completely out.